All right, people, it's about that time. One more stop on the Stop to the Red Wedding, Season 3, Episode 8. We're almost done with Season 3, Pat. This is kind of crazy. I'm still, kind of tripping out just a bit here with the episode entitled Second Sons, Episode 28 of our 73-episode-long recap series covering this show. You got anything to say before we get going?
Hey, listen, Dom, I think the Talkin TV family is going to agree with me on this one, that this show is full of second actors. Although we're seeing the first actor here tonight, we're definitely going to see a second one further down the line.
Indeed, it's the latest in the Game of Thrones notorious recasting game. All of that and more. Stay tuned. All right, Pat, Season 3, Episode 8, entitled Second Son. Now, this is a little bit of an interesting one because this is one of those episodes where, as an episode in and of itself, just based on where it is placed within the season and as a whole, you wouldn't think that this would be that important of an episode. But upon rewatching, I got to say, this ended up being a tremendously important episode for a couple of different reasons. Because, yeah.
Dude, I'm just going to say it right now. I put it on this morning. I woke up. First thing I did was put it on Game of Thrones. And I was like, oh, yeah, the last couple of episodes have been a slog. So I'm just going to wake up, get through it, and that's it. Dude, I basically almost jumped through a couple episodes. Try to this got me excited.
Yeah, it's
for
crazy.
What's going to happen next week.
It's
this episode
crazy.
Was a banger,
yeah.
If you want to call it that.
Absolutely, because the crazy thing, right, is we've been hyping it up all season, right? Once we pretty much got past the halfway point, we're like, okay, the last two episodes, they were good, but they were kind of a little bit slow, And so you're constantly just waiting for in hindsight of the show, waiting for the Red Wedding to happen. And then you watch this episode, you're like, holy fuck, all of this happens in this episode. All the shit that happens in this episode, I completely forgot about. Because this is the beginning of the Arya Hound segment, which I don't know why, but I always feel like that happens a lot earlier than it does. I keep forgetting that it really doesn't start until this episode. Obviously, Tyrion and Sansa's wedding, ultimately. But you also get the whole Melisandre Gendry Leach scene, which unintentionally sets up for all the death that we're about to see happen to all the three characters that she named, ultimately. And then the ending scene, which, again, is so often forgot about. But this is the episode that first shows, what weapons are effective against White Walkers? These White Walkers that we've seen hyped up for the first two seasons, ultimately. And this is the one that shows, these things are killable, definitely, And there's all this important, crazy stuff that happens, and it's honestly kind of surprising almost. And I don't know, why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, I'm going to point out Eric in the comments. He's saying that Game of Thrones is never a slog, but
hard disagree there. Hard disagree there. This is coming from one of the biggest Game of Thrones fans there is. Hard disagree.
Listen,
there.
I think one of it has to do with the hindsight. We've already gone through the show 2-3 times. We're going through it a fourth time, talking about it here on the channel. I think it's one of those things, some episodes are better than others. Yeah, they're all good. I think if you watch them straight through and you kind of binge the show, you're not going to feel that slog. But when you know a lot of the stuff, there's basically just awesome scenes. And then some of the episodes, they just don't have that overall pacing and excitement. And I think that the last couple episodes had great scenes, don't get me wrong. But this one, basically just the way it was put together, everything just kind of one after the other, everything was exciting. I think it's the last episode's focused on character. This focused on basically events and action and moving the story forward. So yes, there's a lot of world building at times, and it's awesome. But sometimes world building can be low energy, and you're just waiting for the shoe to drop, like it did this episode.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and yes, Eric, also that is correct. Yes, Francis from Deadpool is in this one. I always find that funny. Was there ever a point where this dude was Ed Skrein? Because I feel like the problem was, right, he had this one bit on obviously this season, obviously as Dario before Tori gets recast ultimately by Michelle Huseman in the next season. Ironically enough, another dude that would go on to being a huge show. Obviously, is one of the 5 siblings in the first season of the Haunting series, Haunting of Hill House. He's the main dude in that one, the second Dario. Then he obviously goes and does the Transporter reboot movie that they do in 2015. And then obviously his biggest claim to fame is his Deadpool. And then also, I think he was in that Alita Battle Angel movie. I don't know. He's a really good actor, but I always feel, I don't know what it is. I think he's just got those like facial features and like there's just something inherently untrustworthy about this guy. And I feel like that's translated across like movie producers as well. I don't know. But as far as getting this started, we're going to spend a lot of time with Daenerys and Essos this season. Like I said, last episode was like, the beginning of this, obviously this season was cool, but like this is like low-key, like a really big Daenerys season, just in general. So, but we got one scene in order to kick off this episode. First, obviously,
the show opens up with The Rock. Dwayne, it's not Dwayne The Rock, but
not Dwayne The Rock.
It's a different Rock.
Rocky Johnson.
Yeah,
I wonder if it was his dad, the Boulder, or his son, the Pebble.
Yeah, no, this is just a stationary rock that Arya is going to use to kill the Hound, and basically she sneaks up on him in the morning and raises it above his head, and then he wakes up and looks her dead in the eyes and says, "I'll give you one blow, and it better do the job, because otherwise you're in for a world of hurt." And I'm paraphrasing there, but yeah, Arya soon realizes this ain't the moment to take out the Hound.
And as it turns out, it's ultimately like kind of worked better to her advantage if she does keep the Hound alive, because she learns to put her petty, well, not petty, but her grievances with the Hound aside once she realizes, well, you know, he kind of gives her this monologue. Ultimately, it's like, you know, you're the truth is you're not so good here on your own. You might want to stick with me just in general. I'm going to look out for you. And then she thinks that he's taking her to the Blackwater because she thinks that he's taking her back to King's Landing. He's like, King's Landing? What the hell? He's like, fuck King's Landing. I'm not going back there. He's like, I'm giving you, is like, as much as your precious brotherhood wants. It's like, no, I'm taking you to the twins where, what's it called? Where I'm gonna sell you to your brother and your mother. And they're gonna
the word of marriage has spread across the countryside. And so he's looking for a little reward by returning Arya to the Starks at this wedding. And that's where they're going. And basically, yeah, this scene essentially has the Hound tell Arya, like, listen, it was basically me who stood between Sansa, getting assaulted and ending up with her throat cut. So you might want to just trust me a little bit. There's worse people to have met, on the road in these dangerous areas. And, the Hound basically says he's not a threat to her. He's basically has his agenda, which is to get some sort of reward. But other than that, he's going to make sure that she gets to where she got to go. So it should be an easy truce, but a truce nonetheless.
Exactly, and it's a pairing that ultimately leads to, like, again, one of the best pairings on the entire show. We talked about Jaime and Brienne all this season, but next season we get Arya and the Hound ultimately. We don't spend as much time in the Riverlands next season as we do this season for obvious reasons, but this is kind of unintentionally like one of the better pairings. Here you have one person who ultimately has been defined by trauma and just kind of needs an outlet to like let some of that trauma out. And here you have another person who is also defined by the trauma of their past ultimately. And it creates like kind of this really weird synergy for two people that like should kind of hate each other, but end up like having this really impressionistic bond. And even though it is a moment that is totally original to the show, and again, it is in an episode that has been so heavily bastardized at this point, I will say that the way that Arya and the Hound's arc pays off in the bells at the end of the show when he kind of tells her, you need to go because otherwise you're just going to be damaged and dead inside like me. And like that moment at the end, like that really is like truly satisfying and like surprisingly like a really touching way to like kind of end their story arc. Like I have a lot of complicated thoughts in the finale just in general because there's so much that I love in there in addition to so much that I hate in there, but it's really interesting kind of how this one little scene, it's the one brief scene that we get. This is another one of those episodes that opens and closes with like the one brief scene. But it's really interesting, and I think it's a really awesome setup for where we're going to go next. So next we have 3 big storylines. Again, this is kind of, I like to call this episode like kind of like, let's call it catching up on all the B plots. We don't have any more gratuitous scenes of Theon being tortured. You don't spend any time with Jon and the wildlings. You don't have anything of Robb and his journey towards the twins. Nothing like that. You get 3 big storylines. You get Essos with Daenerys. You get Dragonstone with catching up on with Stannis and Davos, who we really haven't seen that much of this season. And you get King's Landing with Tyrion and Sansa's wedding. So we start off in Essos. Daenerys is ultimately making her next ploy against Yunkai. She learned last episode from the Yunkai slave owner that they have many friends. So she ultimately through Jorah and Barristan, managed to figure out who exactly that is that they are in league with.
Listen, it shouldn't have been that hard because apparently they walked around the side of the city and they saw a mercenary camp, and it's like, I guess there's their friends.
Crazy. There they are.
So it didn't really take them that long to figure it out. They're the Second Sons, band of mercenaries.
Yes, hence the title.
Exactly. They agreed to fight for Yunkai, and they're led by this guy who's I guess the
Miro,
bastard of a Titan.
A Titan's bastard, which is just a nickname. Like, she meets these three guys ultimately in her tent, just to kind of gauge them, see where they are. Ultimately, the goal is she wants to get them to break contract with Yunkai, and obviously come over to her, the winning side. Or kind of her wager, her bet is that, look, if this guy is as full of himself as she thinks, she's not going to want to lose to a woman.
Yeah, and this Titan's bastard,
man, this guy would have been canceled so many times. I feel bad for this actor ultimately in hindsight.
Well, listen, he did a great job being one of the most sleazy people I've ever seen in Essos, or in this world of Game of Thrones.
Show. How about that?
Yeah, number one, I think. I'm going to be hard pressed to figure out who is sleazy. Kind of the equivalent of trailer trash, so to speak.
Or should I say down there?
Yeah, he's the Game of Thrones version of the Trailer Park Boys or whatever that show is from Canada. They could basically, they can bring him back, and they can, they could have a medieval version of that show right here in Essos. But hey, I wanted to say, this was a great scene. It just shows Daenerys in command of her machinery, her armies, and the diplomatic side of things. So for the most part, it's the Titan's bastard is not having any of it.
No.
It's just wants to, hey, once we beat your armory, maybe the Second Sons and I share everything. Maybe we'll share you.
Well,
that was one of the aggressive lines
that
I can say here on the channel without feeling sleazy myself.
What's interesting about this scene is that you get these three different kind of approaches, right? Daario, who's kind of remaining silent. Obviously, this is our introduction to Daario Naharis, who would eventually join Daenerys' camp, obviously portrayed by Ed Skrein, ultimately for only this episode and the next two that he's in, before he's famously recast next season with Michelle Huseman. Probably, I think the biggest reason why people talk about his recasting is because it's the most notable, because Tommen, the whole thing about all the other, Game of Thrones has famously had 8 different recastings throughout the entirety of the show. But the thing is that with the majority of the other recastings, the characters that were recast really were only like background players. They didn't really have that many moments of dialogue, and when they did, they were like very brief. Like, you never really noticed the differences between the three different actors that played the Mountain. Beric Dondarrion got one scene before he was recast. Same with Marcella and Tommen. They were pretty much like kept on the back burner, and then by the time they were brought in and they were different actors, you didn't even realize it ultimately. Same with the Three-Eyed Raven. He was only in one episode. But the thing that's so notable about Dario's recasting is that Daario had a pretty major part ultimately in this season, just as far as kind of the role that he plays both within Daenerys and within kind of the transition for Yunkai. Ultimately, it's crazy, again, in hindsight, where if Yunkai feels like it's going to be so important, and then how they solve that at the end of this season, and obviously then how we how we see what happens with Meereen next season, how that goes for where Daenerys is going to stay for the next 2 seasons ultimately. But Daario,
I would say his recasting is as noticeable as Don Cheadle in Iron Man 2.
Yeah,
it's one of those things where
people still talk about Terrence Howard to this day, 13 years later.
Yeah, exactly. So it's one of those things where it's an important character. Well, to a certain degree, I think it's a character that's in the forefront of the Daenerys storylines for a few seasons, and then once Daenerys sort of flies off with her dragon and kind of wanders around for a little bit on her own, the character sort of gets minimized at that point. But I think for the in this particular sequence, just getting to know the character, that he fights for love and beauty. And I think the scene where he's talking with his fellow mercenaries, where, he basically brings up what he fights for. It's women, basically who want to make love with you. And that's one of the reasons to live. And then the other one is basically killing someone that is fully determined to kill you. Those are the thrills of life that he seeks. And I think they did a really great job setting up this character and getting, some sort of warrior like this at Daenerys' side.
100%. And the biggest takeaway for me within that scene, ultimately, both with the scene where they meet with Daenerys and their scene later on at the tent, is it really establishes, surprising enough, in only one scene, ultimately, because this is with the other two captains, right? Miro and the other guy, who I'm not even going to bother to remember his name. It's the only scene that we really get to know how these guys work ultimately. Because the whole thing about how they change this from the book, this is actually, the whole thing is they changed a lot of this from the books ultimately. So Daenerys in the books ultimately meets with two of the Yunkai mercenary troops. The Second Sons were actually led by a different guy. In the books, they were led by Brown Ben Plum, who ultimately ends up betraying her and going back to Yunkai and Meereen once they end up like rejoining in order to fight with her in the later seasons and books. Dario and his guy Miro, what's it called? Miro and the other guy, they are leaders of the Storm Crows, which is a completely different troop. But the thing that I love that's established here is like kind of their each motivations as far as what they get out of it. Miro is only in it for like, in order to kind of buff up his own ego. He doesn't view women as, people. He only views them as property. Ultimately, he doesn't take Daenerys or her conquest seriously. He believes only in their might. The other guy, Prendal something, his whole thing is in the logistics and the technicalities. He's very much about, you're in your place, you're in your place. And the whole thing is, his whole thing that he establishes is that, look, we can't break contract to join you, because if we do, we only have a reputation to go off of, right? If we break that, that's our only word. We're good. And Daenerys obviously makes the ploy. It's like, fight with me and you'll never have to worry about it again. But Dario is the only one that seems remotely interested, because Dario, the thing about this guy is that he seems to be the first character that we've met in this universe that fights for something other than himself, which is strange to consider that he's the leader of a mercenary troop. But like I've often found this with just bounty hunter kind of figures in general, loners, drifters, people who don't really belong to any one side or cause ultimately, which is that they ultimately kind of believe in themselves to an extent that they kind of understand the depths and pitfalls of humanity, so they can almost like kind of learn to appreciate things in a way that a lot of people, others who are like kind of trapped within these systems, can ultimately. And that's why I think that in a strange way, that's why her and Daenerys' relationship, him and Daenerys' relationships is ultimately one of the more interesting and more underrated relationships. I think it's kind of confusing because the amount of sexual activity we see between the two is very, very minimal. Ultimately, I think we only get like one or two scenes with them throughout the entirety of it. But the whole thing is that Daenerys is a character that has only been marked by tragedy. And so her whole thing is only ultimately about like, what's next as far as who she can liberate and make sure that the trauma that happened to her doesn't happen to really anybody else. And Dario kind of comes in and shows her, it's like, hey, you can, still enjoy life just a little bit. Life doesn't always have to be so super miserable and so super dour, and you have to like dedicate yourself to this cause. You can like chill back and enjoy it a little bit. And you can tell that's his philosophy that's kind of shown here. And it's shown brilliantly, obviously, in the next scene where they obviously pick their coin, because Miro brings up the idea. It's like, look, we can end this right now. Ultimately, we won't have to worry about a battle, because obviously the thing that's shaping up is Daenerys, they're going to have to fight the Second Sons before obviously they can fight with Yunkai. And the interesting thing obviously here that also separates Dario from the crew is that Dario easily sees through Sir Barristan's lie. Sir Barristan says they have 10,000 Unsullied, but Dario knows that they only have 8,000. So that immediately separates him from the other two.
Yeah, again, a perfect dialogue. Like Daenerys basically responds and says, oh, even if your count were to be true, doesn't the dynamic remain the same? I have more men than you do. So, in war, that means I'm going to beat you and you're going to die. So yes. I think Daenerys plays it off very quickly, very, sleek. And for the most part, we're just seeing in this season her diplomatic skills and, her command of her army go through the roof. She basically has learned and is really on the track to being a great leader, and we see it all throughout this season.
Absolutely, 100%. And like for me, the biggest thing too ultimately is once obviously they draw a coin, it's just how like that last act is set up for her arc in this episode, I should say, is set up so well, where you see him walking through the Unsullied camp dressed as the Unsullied, right? And you don't know whether he's going to kill her or not. He goes in, Missandei and Daenerys are having some conversation about, how she speaks Dothraki. Turns out she's pronouncing this one phrase wrong this entire time, ultimately, because, again, she learned from Doria, and Doria is obviously no longer with us, but now she's got Missandei, and Missandei is a trained scribe in languages, so she knows, like, how to speak all of them properly.
Yeah, I think she mentions 19 in the scene.
Something like that. Yeah, she knows a ridiculous amount of languages, ultimately. And, again, I think that's even more impressive considering the fact that Missandei in the books is supposed to be like a 9-year-old girl, ultimately, not like, Natalie Emmanuel. But the biggest thing for obviously Dario sneaks in, he surprises her, and he shows off the 2 heads of the other captains, reveals that it's like, yeah, I only do what I want. Nobody tells me what to do. And he ultimately proves that, yeah, Daenerys has won him over, surprisingly, not for any other reason other than states that he has fallen in love with her. And he doesn't expect her to believe him at once, not at all. And all that he says is that, look, I do what I want ultimately. What's it called? And you have the righteous cause, and I've fallen in love with you ultimately. So, and she manages to get his allegiance and the allegiance of the Storm Crows ultimately. So, what's kind of your takeaway from that whole sequence?
I just want to go back to what you said about the, sexual tension between the 2 of them. And I think this is one of the long, ongoing storylines throughout the whole series that's done really well. So, the fact is he sneaks into her chamber when she's taking a bath, tells them not to scream, has a very civil conversation with them. She, is emboldened to basically stand up fully naked in front of him, get dressed, continue the conversation. And it's one of those things where it's clear that the 2 of them, are sort of on the back burner. This is what they're thinking about, even though they're talking about war and the Second Sons, etc. And I think going to your earlier point of, just how they are in this relationship and, ultimately Daenerys kind of uses him not only for his, small military, advantage, command abilities, the mercenaries that he brings to the cause. Basically, she kind of uses him as, someone that she can be intimate with. And, as soon as the, all the armies have to move to Westeros, guess what? He's the first one to, he's the last person, in the line of tickets on that ship, and there's no more tickets left.
Exactly.
So, it's one of those things where it's like, I got to go actually marry,
a rich lord.
Exactly. Someone that has a name, someone that has titles. So I can't really take a Mr. Wife or whatever it is.
Right. Again, it's another one of those situations that just makes me think about the last couple seasons, and I'm like, man, were they really as off as everyone said they were? Like, again, I still don't think that the storylines and the way that they wrapped up are that bad. It's just a matter of like how they were executed ultimately. Because again, it's like a constant question that I did have ultimately is, would Daenerys have acted any differently in those last couple seasons if she had Dario with him? Because after a certain point in the later couple seasons, like around seasons 5 and 6, it did seem like, because at that point, Barristan is dead. Jorah had been exiled. How many times? I lost count. Tyrion was her counselor, but we obviously know that Tyrion ultimately did not prove to be one of the better counselors for her. And it just makes you wonder, like, yeah, because after a certain point, Dario was really the only one that wouldn't tell her just exactly what she wanted to hear ultimately. And he had a really unique perspective into that instance. It always makes me wonder, I'm like, man, what would have happened if Dario had been with her those last few seasons in Westeros rather than having been left in Essos? But ultimately, we saw what happened there. And, Dario is one of the many storylines that is left unresolved by the end of this show. But yeah, it's a really awesome character introduction. And ultimately, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is like the last of the instances of like introductions of like major characters that will play a part going forward for like the remainder of the show. I think with the exception of the Sand Snakes, but the problem is the Sand Snakes are so badly bastardized that they try to cut them out of the show like as quickly as humanly possible. So that really makes Dario kind of like, in a weird way, the last like major character installment that we meet that like really ends up playing like a major part. So moving on, ultimately, our next of our 3 big storylines that we have this episode, Dragonstone. Oh man. Like,
yeah. So the best part about this is it starts off with Davos in his prison cell trying to read. He's doing better.
Well,
He's still.
That's not how it starts.
That's definitely how it starts.
No, it's not.
Right?
It starts with Melisandre and Gendry arriving on Dragonstone, and then them going to see Stannis.
Oh, and they have like a brief conversation.
And Stannis looks at him. He's like half Robert, half Lowborn, kind of like to prove him. It's the whole thing that's being set up there is because for the longest, the interesting thing about this storyline is again because we spent so little time on Dragonstone in comparison to the last season, or at least what feels like a comparison to the last season, is that we really haven't actually like spent that much time. So we don't actually know what Melisandre is planning. We have an idea of it, but we don't actually know what Melisandre is planning. And this is the episode that kind of like confirms what it is, which is that she has got this giant ritualistic sacrifice plan using some of using some of, the Baratheon bloodline ultimately. She states she can't use Stannis because Stannis is too weak, quote unquote, or doesn't have enough of it. But she used someone like, fresh and youthful and vibrant in order to pull off this sacrifice, which at the end is revealed that she's going to use King's blood and sacrifice them to the fire in order to ensure that all of Stannis' enemies end up vanquishing in strange, mysterious ways, ultimately. Some of them get, a little delayed over time, but...
So I think the main thing is, regardless, Stannis goes to Davos' side because he doesn't quite know how to process what's going on. Because, in one hand, he understands that the Lord of Light exists. He's seen these sort of miracles and he knows what's happening. And in the other hand, he has sort of that Ned Stark honor that kind of, prevents him from fully being all in. And that's the reason why he goes up to Davos. That's the reason why he sort of, when Davos says, I'll never raise a hand to Melisandre, but that doesn't mean I won't, speak out against her. And, they come to an arrangement where essentially Davos is going to be sort of the other advisor to Stannis and make sure that, Stannis doesn't really go too far over the line with all this magic stuff, and that's the real reason why he's freed from the jail and the prison.
Well, here's the interesting thing about that sequence, which I do love. Again, it's probably one of my favorite moments of the entire show, just between Stannis and Davos, and of this episode easily, which is where. It's really one of the only times, and one of the first times that we actually get to see Stannis like really as a human being. Ultimately, he has this really humane moment, and Davos even calls him on that, which is that it's like, look, you could have come to see me yesterday, you could have come to see me the day before, but you're coming to me now because you knew that I would caution against this, because you knew that I would know that this is wrong, which means that which means that you're feeling ultimately in some strange way that this is wrong. And he's kind of like trying to appeal to Stannis' moral side, but Davos really doesn't know what's in for it yet, because the whole thing that's happened is that because of this arrangement that they've come to, was that Davos demands a demonstration, because Stannis states, like, look, you can say all that you want about that, right? And you're innocent, and everything that you say is right and 100% correct, because he brings up the comparison to Renly. Davos is like, Renly wronged you. This boy's done nothing to you, though. This boy is, he has your blood, and he's like, oh, why should I care about some, baseborn boy that Robert bedded once? And he's like, because this boy has your blood at the end of the day. And that's like kind of a running theme throughout these scenes, which is the happenstance of chance ultimately, because that plays obviously a big part within Melisandre's religion ultimately as she comes to later state in the later couple of seasons. And the biggest thing for me that I take away from it is that, okay, this is kind of Stannis both morally excusing himself while at the same time kind of like rekindling any sense of humanity, because that's always been the interesting thing about Davos being kind of the viewpoint into Stannis. This goes also back to the books, in that we don't get Stannis or Melisandre as like the narrating chapters, because Davos says that, because Davos is kind of like, the human edge, the guy that we can relate to, kind of, for lack of a better word, the everyday working man ultimately. And what's it called? He's like, all right, Stannis, like, you believe this, right? And Stannis states that and describes the vision that he's seen to her. And is like, I never pretended to really be a true believer, but when you've seen the things that I've seen, how can you deny the truth? And so Davos is like, all right, I demand a demonstration. And that leads to the next scene.
Okay. So that leads to a clearly HBO sex scene.
Yeah, HBO
just
is like,
because.
I wonder if they have a quota
gratuitous scene.
They're like, look, we need a certain amount of gratuitous sex scenes in each episode. We got a quota that we got to hit.
We haven't seen Littlefinger's brothel in a while, so let's
Littlefinger yet. So
so let's just do it in what is it, Dragonstone, when Melisandre. So basically, this is actually they do it as a reference to Theon too, because she seduces Gendry, throws him on the table. They're kind of getting into it, and then basically she gets him naked, gets him pumped up, and then the leeches come out, and she puts two on the chest.
Well, first she ties him up, and then
it's
gotta I was about to say, gotta include all the things that are happening here.
Yeah, but I think there's a line where Gendry's like, "Oh, don't put it there," and she's throwing a leech. Down below. So it's one of those things where I think they're purposely referencing Theon, and I think they do it at least twice in this episode. And I think this is the first occurrence, where the leech is just kind of thrown there. But more or less, she lets the leeches get some blood, and then This must be the worst part about it is Stannis and Davos come in the room.
They walk in as this
and she's casually getting dressed and everything, and then it's like Melisandre just has a conversation with Stannis and Davos as if Gendry's not even there with them.
Davos is just there. I don't know, Davos is just watching there. It's like, damn, I know I wanted a demonstration, but not like this.
Yeah, and basically, she gets the leeches off of Gendry. They've taken enough King's blood, and they, put them in the fire. And Stannis says off the names, right? And Robb Stark,
the usurper Robb Stark, the usurper Balon Greyjoy, the usurper Joffrey Baratheon. Not necessarily in that order either. I find it interesting because if I'm remembering correctly, the whole big thing is that Stannis does it. Again, I don't necessarily know I don't necessarily know how kind of accurate they were, but the whole thing of interest here is that, again, it's the rule of threes ultimately. There's this weird underlying theme throughout the entire book series and this entire series of the rule of threes ultimately, but kind of how they can get misconstrued and misthrown out of place, where in the books the whole thing is Balon, if I'm remembering correctly in the books, it's Balon first, then Joffrey, then Robb. And the whole thing is it's supposed to be a big surprise, and because, again, at that point, you're still kind of on the page of oh, man, shouldn't Robb and Stannis be allies ultimately? Why does he consider Robb, a usurper? And then, obviously, the whole thing that goes is that Robb dies first at the Red Wedding. Then they receive word of Balon Greyjoy's death, ultimately, in the Iron Islands. And then, obviously, it's Joffrey's wedding, and he dies. So all three of them do die. In the show, it orders it in the order Robb first, then Balon, then Joffrey. Robb dies first. Then you have Joffrey's wedding at the beginning of next season where he dies, and then Balon doesn't die for another 2 seasons because the creators forgot about the Greyjoy arc, and then they were like, oh yeah, I guess we probably should bring this back into play, So it's definitely a little bit interesting. Obviously, it's definitely a case of another Benioff and goof. There are a lot of those kind of throughout this show, but I find it really interesting where, again, there's obviously this kind of sacred law kind of within obviously just storytelling in general, ultimately within kind of this religion as far as how it goes, and obviously this is supposed to be proof ultimately that the Lord of Light's powers do work, but we obviously see in the finale of this season that doesn't matter for Davos, because Davos' whole thing is look, if the leeches work, that's enough. Why do we have to kill this whole ass person? Why can't we just let him go? And that ultimately, again, it's the humanist in Davos could just never ever bow its head. But I definitely think it's really interesting. I don't know, what are your thoughts on just the whole leeches in the order of things?
I don't think the order really matters that much, to be honest with you. The rule of three, the whole you see the first occurrence, second occurrence, and then typically the third occurrence is something you don't expect.
Right.
That's sort of a base storyline trick, and I enjoy. Hey, it's pretty much in a lot of stories, so it's not surprising to find it here. But I don't read it too much into the order of things. It's just they said the names, and we're gonna see them, and the Greyjoy one I think is just it's tied to the book. But ultimately, it didn't really pay off because the storyline lingers for 2 seasons until he gets thrown
exactly.
over the
Well, the crazy thing too, again, and this is another instance of kind of where, for me at least, I know everyone doesn't like the last 2 seasons, but for me, where season 5 for me was kind of the beginning of the end for Game of Thrones as far as its quality, and then season 6 people briefly forgot about the problems of season 5. But like I said, we'll get to it when I get to season, because I have a lot of problems. I'm not gonna lie, I might have more problems with season 5 than I do with the last 2 seasons, because the problem ultimately that emerges is the whole leeches thing, and what comes of that is supposed to be the middle act of Stannis' arc, right? The first act of Stannis' arc you have is attempted on the Blackwater. That fails miserably, right? Then you have his whole thing in a Storm of Swords and a Dance of Dragons, where Storm of Swords, he does the whole thing with the leeches, right? His 3 enemies do die. They essentially work, ultimately. The blood magic, he proves it. It works. Robb, Balon, and Joffrey all die in instances that Stannis ultimately has nothing to do with, all without Stannis having to lift a finger. Then Davos does the thing with Gendry. Again, it's a different bastard in season 5. What's it called? It's a different bastard in the books. Davos sets him free. Stannis is praying to execute Davos. Davos reads him the letter from the wall stating, okay, this is what's happening up north of the wall. This is where we're needed. And Stannis is like, okay, if I'm going to prove myself as the true king, I'm going to do what no other king is doing, and I'm going to take this threat at the wall seriously. He goes north to the wall. Then he has the whole thing where he's trying to reunite the north against the Boltons. And the problem is Stannis' arc leaves off on a cliffhanger, arguably one of the biggest cliffhangers, right? Because the whole thing is that happens. Stannis' arc with the Dance of Dragons ends. He is preparing to march on Winterfell, but unlike the books, Ramsay never does the sneak attack. Stannis' army just gets stuck in the snow, ultimately. So the problem, ultimately, with how that translates into the show is that they use that as an excuse to kind of get Stannis out of the way. So I think that's another big reason why Stannis' arc feels so unfulfilled, in the show as opposed to the books is because they clearly had a lot more planned with Stannis in a way that maybe they didn't necessarily with Jon, the way that Jon ultimately gets like that really kind of big catharsis in season 6 that it felt like was meant for Stannis ultimately. But I always found that really interesting because like it's the biggest thing because I'm like the way that it leaves off with Stannis, I'm like, wow, this literally almost feels like an afterthought when this was clearly meant to be like the climax of his arc. Like this is his big moment. This is going to be the big I still have this feeling ultimately that he did end up winning in Winterfell, and that the whole thing is that his victory over Winterfell was supposed to make up for his loss to the Blackwater. But I don't know, like what's kind of your take on that?
I think we're getting ahead of ourselves, Dom. I think we could spend the whole next 30 minutes talking about Stannis and his entire arc in the series. I kind of agree with you on a lot of those points. Like, Stannis is this great character. And, I think a lot of my friends, when we were watching it, week to week when the show was first airing, we kind of thought Stannis would go the distance and be a big player throughout the series.
In a way he did, because the strange thing is that of the 5 kings from the original War of the 5 Kings, he's the only survivor.
Yeah, but, like basically Brienne, gets her revenge off screen. And, and it's one of those things where...
Only thing worse than getting killed on Game of Thrones, getting an off-screen death.
Yeah, and so one of those things where, like... I think this whole amount of time that we spend with Stannis throughout the series, I think you're right. It's not really as fulfilling as you would like it to be, and it's just because certain things like this, the leech thing gets stretched out, and he's really not a top tier character. Although the viewers, like me, my friends. When we were watching this, we felt like he was, a little more than he ended up being. So, I think it's one of those things where it is what it is, and you just have to kind of live with it. Stannis is still a good character. Davos, is really an excellent character, and I'm glad that he really takes Stannis' place and goes towards the end of the show.
Absolutely, yeah. Davos easily still probably one of my favorite characters on the entire show. Still maintaining that humanist edge for Stannis ultimately, even into next season. Let's get to the last big storyline that we have before the end of the episode, which is King's Landing, which is, I will say, probably goes in the most surprising direction because it goes in a direction that I feel like nobody was expecting ultimately, because you have this entire... King's Landing has been pretty much on the back burner this entire season. You've been having this really interesting back and forth push and pull between the Lannisters and the Tyrells. They make one political ploy, then the other side makes a political ploy. And this is kind of like really the crux of it. Like, they are wrapping up the whole King's Landing thing in here so that the King's Landing stuff in the finale really does feel like an epilogue ultimately, where the finale plays out like with this big reaction.
Well, it's wedding season, and
it is wedding season.
Here it is.
First of a couple, and it's crazy.
First up.
This seems like it's going to be the most problematic. And then in hindsight, it kind of turns out to be like the least dramatic in a strange way, because it's the only wedding where nobody dies in a vicious, brutally awful way.
Yeah, and we're talking about Tyrion and Sansa. And I feel like Tywin has set it up to be like a baseball game. It's like, now batting, for the Lannisters. Tyrion,
up to bat, Tyrion. Strike one on the plate.
It's so uncomfortable, Tywin and everybody going up to him and being like, you got to do your duty. You got to, once you're married, you got to bed Sansa. And, it clearly weighs on Tyrion just as much as us as an audience. And he just keeps drinking. That's all he's going to do.
Yep, that's all
evening long.
We haven't even gotten to the actual wedding where, again, it's not just Tywin, but everybody is just trying to set them up for failure and make this just as miserable as humanly possible. Like, Tyrion tries to comfort Sansa. He does a terrible job. He doesn't want this. She clearly doesn't want this. Joffrey, of all people, is the one that has to walk her down the aisle, since obviously her dad's not there to do it. Joffrey takes away the stool. He has to freaking bend her. At the very least, though, with all the people that are snickering, Tywin is able to silence them with a look. I love that one scene where you have the 2 extras that are snickering in the background. I can just imagine what the first AD was telling them that day on set, where it's like, okay, when Charles looks at you, you shut the fuck up. He is essentially God in that scene. And the minute that they do, oh man, those guys piped out real quietly.
It's perfect.
So good.
Just
perfect.
the visual acting that he does, just the glances, the looks, everything in this whole sequence, it's phenomenal. I'm joking, but this is really the first sequence where Joffrey goes for the jugular, so to speak. Like, he is all out, war with Tyrion in front
Yes.
of everybody, taking the stool and kind of embarrassing him, and then he wants to do the same thing to both Tyrion and Sansa at the party, right? He takes Sansa aside and says, "Hey, ultimately, at the end of the day, you married
Doesn't matter whose
Tyrion."
Lannister baby is in your
And
belly.
yeah, exactly. It doesn't matter what Lannister does this. Like, I can just maybe, stop by late at night. He's going to be passed out drunk. And if, you have anything to say about it, I'll just have my Kingsguard hold you down. So he's like just brutally
He is going for it. And you know what it feels like? It's almost like a reminder. It's like, man, we haven't spent as much time with Joffrey. We haven't seen Joffrey just be as like purely, completely awful this season as he was last. Here's a reminder of how much you fucking hate this guy,
Yeah, well, he killed Roz. Like, I think that's the biggest thing that he's done in the last couple episodes. But
so brutal.
yeah, like he has just become, this maniac, and I think it's Cersei understands this and tries to direct him, and he goes up to follow Sansa, and she grabs him and says, "Look, Marjorie's over there, alone. You have to secure the relationship."
And
so
Cersei even tries to talk him down ultimately from it, where it's like, you should probably talk to your actual bride to be. And he's like, I'll have a lifetime of that. I also did want to point out the two Cersei sequences in this episode, which are phenomenal. Ultimately, the first scene where Marjorie tries to buddy up to her, and then Cersei tells the story about the Reigns of Castamere, and Reigns of Castamere kind of reminding her, like, kind of keeping her in her place. Ultimately, she's like, kind of like, I know what you're doing here. You put your best foot forward. You failed. And now if you ever try to make a move and try to think of yourself kind of as on my level again, I'll have you smothered in your sleep. Again, it's just like,
yeah, no, the line is you call me your sister again, I'll smother you.
Ultimately shows the difference between the lion and the rose. Cersei has no time for niceties, no time for diplomacy. She is all straightforward to the fact business. And what's even funnier is the scene afterwards where Loras just looks, I don't think I've seen anyone look more miserable. It's ironic because of the two people who are being tortured by this wedding, somehow Tyrion and Sansa both don't look as miserable as Loras does, who has just had like a perpetual pouty face on ever since he's like found out that he's had to do these awful wedding arrangements that he has had no hand in, where Olenna is just rattling off like how they're going to be related, like how each of the different children will be related once Marjorie marries Joffrey and Loras marries Cersei. And then he tries to talk with her afterwards, and he's just like, oh, my father once told me. It's just like no one cares what your father once told you. Like, it's none of it.
Yeah, Cersei is, she's in the zone, and I think, Joffrey is the only thing that's really a problem, because she's there to control him and make sure that no like scene happens, but she can't. She can't control her son. She cannot do sort of that one thing that her father expects her to do, and unfortunately, all the other stuff her father expects her to do, marry Loras, make nice with the Tyrells, that's none of the things that she wants to do. And she's not afraid to let them be aware of that. So I think the whole wedding, she's just struggling to keep Joffrey in check, which unfortunately doesn't work whatsoever.
Not one bit. Because as we came to learn over the course of the last season, if they're the one person who is more worse at their job than Joffrey is as king, is Cersei is being a mother to Joffrey. Because, oh man.
Yeah, and I will just say this, like, the fact is, Joffrey, once he does this kind of threat to Sansa, he turns to everybody and says, oh, let's do the bedding ceremony, let's take Sansa's clothes off and carry her to the bed and all this type of stuff. And Tyrion's like, no, that's not going to happen. There's no bedding ceremony. And Joffrey will just not stop. He's going to do this. He's going to force it to happen until Tyrion, takes a pick or a knife probably, and stabs it on the table and says, basically, if you continue to do this, when you get married, you will have a woman.
This is still one of my favorite scenes because here's the thing, this is not just from this one scene. This has been building up after a season. Tyrion had to spend all of last season cleaning up after Joffrey's mess. Then he has the whole way that he was treated after the Battle of Blackwater. Now he's had this kind of like slow, like kind of low-key, off-key, like trying to figure out and slowly come to the realization that Joffrey almost had him killed for no reason other than the fact that he just doesn't like that his uncle was doing a better job. Now he humiliated him in front of the entire wedding for no reason.
He's drunk and he is humiliated by Joffrey, and he makes the threat. And the threat is, again, in my mind, a second reference to Theon and what happened last episode. So I think they do a pretty decent job, leaving the whole like brutal, sadistic stuff that happened last episode, with Ramsay and Theon. They make reference to it by basically having other characters sort of, reference that region.
It's kind of crazy ultimately how the amount of like strange dick references there are in this episode. Also, in a weird way, like also subtle foreshadowing from this episode as well, with obviously with Cersei telling Marjorie about the reigns of Castamere ultimately, and we're all going to see how that plays out next episode. But ultimately, it almost leads to like some very violent blows that come from this episode, and again, in a weird way, foreshadowing what happens next season, where again, when Joffrey dies, who's the first person that everyone looks to? Tyrion, because the last couple times that they saw, they were like very much not getting along publicly. Tywin is, of course, being ever the diplomat, is able to diffuse it by playing it off with Tyrion being drunk. Also, we forgot to talk about, too, the scene between Tyrion and Tywin ultimately beforehand, which is, again, just like the humiliation just doesn't end, where Tyrion doesn't want this. He knows that this is wrong, and Tywin kind of reminds him, like, look, you will do your duty at the end of the day, and Tyrion is trying to resist. He's like, man, can't a guy just enjoy anything? But Tywin ultimately has to defuse the situation. Tyrion plays it off like a joke, obviously because Joffrey is trying to get the bedding ceremony done. And it's like and Tyrion's like, look, we've both been humiliated enough. We don't need to keep doing with this. But yeah, so they ultimately go into the room, and what's it called? Tyrion tries to start it, but he can't. He just shows he's too good of a person. He's like, look, I'm not going to do anything to you that you do not want to do. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to take advantage of you, nothing like that. And if my father has a problem with that, and if my father wants something fucked, well, he can start with himself or something along those lines. It's a great,
and also like
adage.
Sansa asked the question, like, okay, like, you basically just said you're never going to take me to bed unless I want to. What if I never want to, go to bed with you? And he basically says, well, then I guess my watch has started. He makes a reference to
the Night's
Watch and, being celibate and whatnot. And, it's one of those things where it kind of clues us into, that Tyrion has a sense of honor. Unfortunately, this show really doesn't do well for characters that have a sense of honor. That honor usually is what gets them killed.
Right.
And so, Tyrion at this point is showing that, he's basically acting that way. And I think that's what probably leaves him open for what happens early next season, where he is basically accused of the unthinkable.
Absolutely.
At Joffrey's wedding.
Yeah, the good thing about the next couple seasons as they start to deviate from the books is that even though the first 3 seasons shows it seems like the good guys just cannot get a win, in the last couple seasons it shows that man, karma is a bitch, because at the end of the day, these evildoers can only do so much, because it starts with Joffrey in the second episode of season 4, and then it ends with Ramsay at the end of season 6. It's like these evildoers, justice will come for all of them, even if they don't realize it in the end, ultimately. And it's kind of capped off by this really cutesy scene. Obviously, Shay and Tyrion have not been having the best of times throughout this entire season, but ultimately, Shay sees the bed and sees that Tyrion and Sansa did absolutely nothing, and she kind of has this brief moment and this little smile. So those are the majority of the 3 big arcs, but there's one more scene before the episode wraps up, and again, it's so quick and brief that you would almost forget that it happened in this episode, but it ends up being so crucially important for the majority of the show. We check back in north of the wall, ultimately. It's a quick, brief scene with Sam and Gilly. We haven't seen them in a couple episodes. We've only been checking in with them briefly since the whole revolt at Craster's, ultimately, earlier in the season. But,
so basically, we reinforce that Sam cannot light a fire.
No, correct.
100%.
Sam cannot light a fire to save his own life.
Yeah, do not trust him with the matches or anything. Just, he ain't going to get it done.
Yep, not going to happen. Not going to get the job done.
They basically are wandering around the north. They find a cabin. They go in. Sam fails miserably. Gilly basically instantly creates a fire. But the whole time that they're doing this, they're talking about what to name the baby, and it's what is it going to be? Your father's name, Randall, Tarly. What is it, Castor? Or Craster, or whatever. And it's one of those things where Sam is sort of stepping up to the plate here and being like, counseling her as if they're, married. And it's like, no, don't do that. That's bad, whatever. And it really, they're starting to get really personal with each other, and very,
Right.
just comfortable, being sort of together.
Yeah.
And then a bunch of crows. Oh my God.
Well, I mean, the first thing
Just go nuts
before the whole conversation between them is obviously him breaking down the difference between obviously first and last names ultimately, which is that I think that it's really kind of touching and heartfelt ultimately what comes from it, which is that they're breaking down the differences. Ultimately, he explains like the difference between his dad's first and last name, and she's like, oh well, Randall's a nice name, and he's just kind of like, please don't name him Randall, please. I still love that, and she's like, she kind of sees the look on her face. He's able to like get across. Obviously, he didn't go through the horrors that she went through ultimately living with Crasser. Ultimately, like he was never sexually abused by his father, but the whole thing is that it's like she says like, is your father cruel like mine was? He's like, different sort of cruel, but she like understands that it's like, yeah, this guy Randall Tarley, who we don't see for another couple seasons, is just bad news with just the way that he treated Sam ultimately. But then you're right,
yeah, we don't see him until he's basically incinerated.
Pretty much. Yeah, we get like one scene with him, but we get one scene with him before what's it called in season 6, and then in season 7 ultimately
one dinner before he is dinner.
Before he is
but basically, this scene is really well done. Like
a peck of crows, like it's amazingly well done how it's set up, kind of reinforcing like the horror tropes that the White Walkers kind of bring with them. Ultimately, the one White Walker comes out of the trees. Sam tries to repel it by trying to exude some form of bravado. That doesn't work at all.
Yeah, we see the cool sword exploding trick. The White Walker grabs it, explodes. Basically, just like bats him with one hand across and he's going straight for the baby. That's what the White Walkers want.
Oh man, Eric just brought up another recasting real quick that I forgot about. Sam's younger brother, Dickon Tarley, gets recast. Goes from Harry Potter actor to Umbrella Academy actor.
Gotcha. Yeah, exactly. Those are those second actors that show up in this show.
Keep happening.
Yeah. So, anyway, at the end of the day, Sam gets back up. He has the dragon glass dagger in his pocket, and he just lunges it into the shoulder blades of the White Walker. And, basically Gilly and Sam just like dumbfoundedly look at the White Walker as it screams out in pain. They're just standing there like, I guess he could kind of still kill us, but he looks hurt.
Right.
He looks hurt.
They're almost a surprise. I'm almost like the White Walker is being. I feel like the White Walker is almost looking at him. It's like, bitch, did I just get killed by this fucking fat kid right here? Like, what just happened? But again, crucially important.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I would put it as crude as that, Dom. But I guess that could have been what's happening in this demon creature's mind. But anyway, he basically just explodes, and that's that.
The whole established here obviously is the whole thing with the dragon glass, the fact that it's like, okay, so these things have been being built up for God only knows how long, but it's just brilliantly how they throw in the brief little layers where it's like we had 2 seasons of these things being introduced as like kind of these unstoppable killing machines. They can kill anyone, right? They can bring anyone they want back to any human that they kill back to life. Ultimately, there's seemingly no way to stop these things. We know obviously that fire can stop the reanimated corpses, but we have no idea if anything can work effectively on these things. And ultimately it's revealed at the end of the day, it's like, oh shit, these dragon glass weapons that they found at the Fist of the First Men last season are revealed to be like something that they can actually use against these things ultimately. And now it shows us like, okay, that whatever's going to happen at the end, at the very least now our heroes have a chance. But kind of the way that it's constructed, and the fact that also it's given to Sam, who is introduced as like one of the most pitiful, hopeless characters in there. It shows it's like, man, even the people who have the least expectations on them ultimately can maybe get a win in ultimately. So that's what makes this moment so satisfying. On top
and I think it also makes it satisfying because like we still don't know anything about the threat.
Right.
Basically, we know they're zombies. We know they're scary. We now know that they have a weakness, but we really don't know how many of them there are. We don't really know. We're never going to get a sense of like the fact that there's legitimately an army of zombies.
Right.
We saw a nice little troop walking through the snow, in previous episodes. But when you get to Hardhome and you see just the amount of the dead that he's collected, that's when things start to really sink in. It's like that and the reveal of what they do with the babies. And when we first meet the Night King, it's nice how this is the third season and it's such a slow burn of knowing what the show's ultimate evil is. And then immediately picks up when it needs to.
Absolutely, yeah, and especially considering that this is really the last time that we see the Walkers really in kind of playing a major part in the season, because really next season the Walkers are almost kind of on the back burner because of how much the emphasis is put on the threat of the wildlings with the attack on the wall being so imminent. That really the only sequence of the Walkers that we get next season is the one scene of the baby being brought to, obviously, that weird ice fortress in general and him being transformed into the White Walker. It's very interestingly shown how that happens.
Yeah, the Fortress of Solitude, right?
Yeah, and it's honestly almost works in their favor because of how minimal the kind of impetus is on them in season 4. You almost forget about them, and it just makes the attack on Hardhome when it happens even more surprising. But again, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Because again, we will save that all for when we get to season 5 ultimately, because again, I'm gonna have a lot to talk about once we get to season 5 ultimately. But that was it. That was our review and recap of season 3, episode 8, entitled Second Sons. Ultimately, a surprisingly fast-paced and incredible episode. Ultimately, probably one of my favorites of these first 3 seasons. We'll be back next week. Next week, people. It's game time. Ultimately, we've been building up to it.
It's game time. Bring your popcorn.
Bring your popcorn.
Bring your foam finger.
Bring your phone finger. Bring your Kleenex boxes. Bring them all. It's red wedding time next week. It's the reigns of Castamere. Ultimately, we'll be back next week. Same time, same place, 8 o'clock p.m. sharp. In the meantime, thank you guys once again for tuning in to another episode of Talkin Thrones. Pat, where can the good people follow you on the internet?
Hey, listen, I'm here on Talkin TV, Talkin Thrones with you, Dom, and hey, it's fun. And I have, an Instagram account at Patrick W. Huber. If you want to follow me and wait for my post to drop, it will happen. Just not today.
Today.
I will post some photos when I get around to it. But hey, you can subscribe if you want to, and eventually I'll be posting. Other than that, hey. This was a great episode.
Yes, absolutely great episode.
Let's get ready for next week.
Let's get ready to rumble. Last 2 episodes, penultimate, and then the finale ultimately in the following episode. I still can't believe that we're already pretty much almost done with season 3. It still feels like yesterday that we just started this. Ultimately, you can follow me at Movie Nerd Reviews on Facebook and Instagram. I just actually posted. Surprised enough, this is like the closest that I've made 2 posts ultimately recently with my most recent 2 posts on my Instagram. You can also follow us primarily on the Talkin TV Podcast social media profiles at Talkin TV Podcast, Facebook and Instagram. And also be sure to click the subscribe button, click the like button, click the bell next to it. That way you guys get notified every time we put up new content, which we give to you guys every day. For you, the people, the content that you deserve. We're almost done with 2021. It's kind of crazy. We're already halfway through November. We've only got 6 weeks left of the year ultimately. So stay tuned for all of the content. We still got a lot of content planned for you guys for the rest of the year. We'll see you guys ultimately on the way to the throne. See you guys next time. 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies.